Good evening, I'm James Macpherson, filling in for Andrew Bolt, who is back next week. Coming up tonight, why your groceries and electricity are about to get more expensive, even as the Prime Minister promises cost of living relief. But is it too little too late? Speaking of the Prime Minister, he's clearly not getting the message, because today Elbow said he wants to follow in the footsteps of the US and extend his term from 3 years to 4. I'll talk to my panel and ask, do we really need more Elbow? A warning for the US, it's set to face a reckoning in 2024. I'll speak to an esteemed author and fellow from the Hoover Institute. And the UK government is in crisis after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is caught lying over immigration numbers. More later in the show. But first, union leaders have warned the government that a religious discrimination bill must not allow faith-based schools to hire staff based on their faith. And it makes sense, right? I mean, if faith-based schools are permitted to go around hiring people on the basis of faith, they'll be faith-based. And that's a problem because, hang on, isn't the point of a faith-based school that the staff all share the same faith? Well, no, because according to union leaders, that would be discrimination against people of other faiths or of no faith at all. And trust me, no one understands discrimination on a job site better than union leaders. Try going on a union-controlled construction site as a contractor without union membership, and you'll find out just how well they understand discrimination. Federal Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has told faith leaders he's working on a religious discrimination bill that will be ready mid-year, though based on the tardiness of his department's work around convicted terrorists being freed from prison, we're not sure if he means middle of this year or middle of 2032. To be fair, religious leaders were promised a religious discrimination bill by Malcolm Turnbull as reassurance during the same-sex marriage debate that a change to the definition of marriage would not infringe upon religious practice. Same-sex marriage was legalised back in 2017. Religious people are still waiting for their promised protections. In the meantime, Archbishop of Hobart, Julian Porteous, spent 2 years and more than $500,000 defending himself before a tribunal for the crime of sharing Catholic doctrine on marriage with Catholic families whose children attended a Catholic school because they valued Catholic teaching. But all of that upset a transgender former Greens candidate who took exception. Well, we can't have that, except without a religious discrimination bill, we do. Let me give you another example. Essendon Football Club CEO Andrew Thorburn was forced out of his job for the crime of attending a church that held traditional views on gender and the sanctity of life. I could spend the rest of this program giving examples. Instead, I'll give you just one more. City Point Christian College in Brisbane was threatened with defunding and the principal forced to resign after they dared to ask parents enrolling their children in a Christian school to simply acknowledge on an enrolment contract that the school would teach a Christian view of sexuality and a biological view of gender. Well, the reaction was fierce. And then Queensland Education Minister Grace Grace, who has a non-binary child, well, she was irate. She thundered to media.
And no student should be denied a world-class education because they're a member of the LGBTIQ+ community, particularly my child.
Well, first, no child was being denied an education, world-class or otherwise. Like I said, parents were simply asked to acknowledge that they knew they were enrolling in a Christian school. And if parents still weren't happy, well, they only had a choice of 1,262 public schools. City Point Christian College was accused of trying to, and I quote, abusively heteronormalise children, by which critics, I assume, meant, teach the Bible. Imagine a Christian school using Christian teaching on sexuality and scientific fact on gender as a basis for their policies. Well, we can't have that, and increasingly, we can't. Because the moment religious people dare to exercise their freedom of speech, their freedom of association, or their freedom of conscience, they're caught in a spiderweb of state-based anti-discrimination laws that fail to recognise religious freedom as a fundamental right and instead regard it as a special exemption to be granted or removed according to the prejudices of their betters. Speaking of the government and the unions, but I repeat myself, Health Services Union National Secretary Lloyd Williams said his union would stand against any legislation that allowed an employer to preference hiring someone of faith. He told the Australian newspaper Today the Coalition's bill would have allowed discrimination towards workers of a particular faith and certainly people of a different sexual orientation. We would hope that this government, when it goes forward with any bill, will put protections in there for workers so they can't be discriminated against based on what religion they do or do not follow. And not to be outdone, CFMEU National Secretary Zack Smith also declared his union stood for the clear principle that no one should be discriminated against at work. Well, let me ask you this. Does a political party discriminate when it selects candidates whose beliefs are aligned with the party's? Of course not. They're exercising their right to select people who will maintain the ethos of their organisation. So why would the Labor Party or the unions, and again, I repeat myself, deny religious organisations the same basic right? Or are we saying the Labor Party can select candidates based on ethos, but religious schools shouldn't be allowed to select teachers based on ethos? Isn't that discrimination? The Labor Party prefer candidates based on gender to fulfil their gender quotas. But what, religious schools shouldn't be allowed to prefer teachers who believe in gender? Come on, Labor's energy policy makes more sense than this. And you know that's saying something. Do you ever get the feeling that the real agenda here is not ending discrimination, but ending Christian schooling? After all, if Christian schools are forced to employ people who don't agree with their Christian values, the school's entire reason for being is undermined, and parents wouldn't see any point in enrolling their children there at all. Eventually, religious schools would close down, leaving only public schools. If parents don't like the Christian stance on sexuality and gender, there are literally thousands of options available to them. But destroy the faith-based schooling system, and parents who don't like the state's stance on sexuality and gender will literally have no options available to them. Australia needs a bill to protect the rights of religious people to speak, assemble and believe as their faith dictates, not according to the dictates of the Labor Party or the unions. But again, I repeat myself. Well, if you thought 2024 was going to be easier on the household budget, think again. The cost of your weekly shop, which already requires a second mortgage, is about to get even more expensive thanks to the government. The Nationals are warning that changes to the Pacific Island Farm Worker Scheme will push food prices even higher. Joining me now is Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, thanks for your time. This scheme allows farmers to hire workers from Pacific Island countries for up to 4 years when there are local worker shortages. So that makes sense, but what changes is the government proposing to the scheme that's going to affect grocery prices?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. What they've done is taken away what we call the averaging provisions, and what that allowed to do was to average out because of the weather. And unfortunately, what happens is it rains. You can't send workers out to pick into the paddock to get that product out of a paddock and onto your plate. So what we had in place was over the 9 months of each year that they were here for the 4 years, you could average out the days that they were sitting on the couch and couldn't go out into the paddock across the whole season. But what the government's now done is said you can't average that anymore. And what the farmer must do, regardless of whether they're in the paddock or lying on the couch, has to pay them a minimum 30-hour week. Now, this is something we haven't had to do for temporary workers, whether they be backpackers or Australian workers before. And when we lost our backpackers and the government cancelled the ag visa, effectively we've got a shortage, and now we've got a scheme that was meant to replace it all that now has become unviable for many farmers. Because we're not talking about 1 or 2 workers on each farm. They're talking tens, sometimes hundreds on each of these farms that farmers are having to pay. And if they have to pay for 30 hours a week for someone to lie on the couch and do nothing, then that's not sustainable for not just a farmer, that's not sustainable for any business. And where this common sense provision that we put in place that allowed for the vagaries of weather has been taken away because of an ideology of the union movement and the Labor Party, means that consumers will have to pay more and farmers will either be forced out because they can't afford to do it, and that means that supply will go down, prices will go up, but the ones that will simply have to push that through to the checkout, which every Australian will have to pay. We need 172,000 extra workers in farms and processing sector. The Pacific scheme alone could only brought in 42,000. We're working at 60% capacity at the moment, and this will just drive it further down in terms of supply output.
The other problem here is that large numbers of Pacific Islanders come to Australia to work under this scheme, then ditch the scheme to seek asylum, 1,050 in the past 6 months. And then farmers are left out of pocket because they've had to pay recruitment fees and they're short of workers. That's another problem with this scheme.
It is, and I think I want to take seriously any asylum claim that's made, and should be taken seriously. But when you see such a significant number from such a concentrated area where we haven't seen the civil unrest that we have in other parts of the world, makes me concerned and suspicious that this is more about gaming the system than it is about a genuine asylum. And that's where I think we need to have a good hard look at this. And I think one of the failings that we had is that when we had the Pacific scheme up and going, there were absconders. We should have made examples of those absconders from those employees who paid for their airfares, who paid for their accommodation, who paid for them to be here, and then ran off and went out of the scheme. We should have sent them home and sent a very strong signal to those Pacific nations. This is a two-way contract. There is remittance that's going back into your economy that's more than what most would get back into your economies, but with that comes a responsibility. And now that we're seeing this asylum claim, I'm very sceptical about it. We should take every claim seriously, but when you see such a large scale from such a concentrated area, something's not right in terms of where the government's taking this Pacific scheme.
Indeed. Speaking of cost of living, Anthony Albanese indicated today he'll be looking to roll out more cost of living relief measures in the May budget, which is really helpful for people who expect the cost of living crisis to affect them in May. But most householders need relief now. Why has it taken the Prime Minister so long to realise this is where money should be spent? Not almost $450 million on the Voice referendum, or what they gave $94.5 million to fight climate change in Vietnam. How come the Prime Minister's only now getting it?
Well, you've got to ask the question, where's he been for the last 19 months? He's been the Prime Minister of this country, and the biggest challenge facing our citizens has been the cost of living crisis. And when he wasted $450 million on a referendum that could have gone in to practical measures about building our economy, instead of wasting on a referendum that we told him he'd conflated recognition with another layer of bureaucracy, you got to point to the fact that this Prime Minister's out of touch. He's out of touch with what the common man is saying on the streets. Cost of living is the biggest crisis that Australians are feeling out there, and it's not about pumping more money into the economy. It's actually pulling the right economic levers. And when you look at what's driving inflation at the moment, keeping interest rates higher for longer, it's actually energy and food, and they're intertwined, because not only are they taking away farmers' labour supply and the supply chain's labour supply, but they're also driving up their energy costs. Our energy bills of much of our food processors are 3 to 4 times higher than what they were previously. And when you've got this reckless race to 82% renewables that is tearing up the very thing it's there to protect, the actual native vegetation and the environment, to put all these solar factories and wind factories and transmission lines, 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines. The reason you're paying more and your inflation is staying high is because while your discretionary spending stopped, your fixed hasn't, because the ideology of this government isn't meeting the practical reality of what's coming out of your wallet. And that's why we're saying pull the right economic levers. It's not about flooding money into the economy. It's about making sure that you have all the energy eggs in the basket. That's including nuclear, as well as carbon capture storage. With the renewables we've got at the moment, we shouldn't go any further. In many respects, we're at a saturation point in renewables without any further planning. And so this is where we need to pause, to plan, to get this right on our energy and on our food security. Otherwise, Australians are going to pay more at their checkout and more on their energy bills.
Well, energy retailers have said they're jacking up prices as well, so there'll be more in that. Just before I let you go, you're in Queensland. I know you're a fair bit inland, but on the east coast, especially on the Gold Coast, they've been hit hard by summer storms. The ADF have been called in to help with the clean-up, but there's more storms on the way and heading north towards Brisbane, so things don't look like easing up for Queenslanders, do they?
No, and we copped it up north just before Christmas in North Queensland with Cyclone Jasper and the front that came through after that. Look, we cop it a fair bit in Queensland, but I've got to say we actually do have recovery down pat. I've got to say that much of the damage that's been done to the grid up here is comparable to a cyclone, and we don't see cyclones in southeast Queensland, so it's going to take a little bit more time, but I know the communities come together. Agencies have worked tirelessly to get many of those towns and those houses back up with power, and it just goes to show that not only do state and local governments and federal governments need to prepare for disasters, but we all do. We've all got a responsibility. We just can't rely on the government or those heroes in uniform that come in and help us in our hour of need. We've all got a responsibility to prepare, but I know that we'll get through this, but we're all obviously always being in Queensland looking to the skies just to see what else is coming.
David Littleproud, thanks so much for your time tonight. Well, lots of news around today. Joining me is the panel, Sky News contributor and host of the Spectator Australia's Australiana podcast, Will Kingston, and the Courier Mail's night editor, Damien Tomlinson. Great to have you guys on board. Now, Anthony Albanese is halfway through his term, and already it feels too long. But get this, Albo announced today that he wants his terms to be extended from 3 years to 4. Have a listen.
Our view, long-term policy, and we've put it to the Australian people, is for 4-year terms. But I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon, and I think that's unfortunate. Every single state has 4 years.
Will, apart from Albo, do you reckon anyone else in the country reckons we need even more Albo?
James, Albo is absolutely right on this. We are, you've got to keep in mind that this will apply just as much to the guy you like as the guy you don't like. We are crippled by short-termism in this country. Look at the cycle of a first-term government. You have the first year honeymoon where they're finding their feet. You have the second year to do something, and then you're in election campaign mode for the third year. Now, Albo buggered that up with the Voice, admittedly, but 1 year out of 3 to get stuff done when this country needs such serious reform is woefully inadequate. We're continuously looking at polls as politicians. They're continuously looking at the election cycle. This may be one way to try and get serious reform back on the agenda in Australia, because at the moment, it's just not there.
Will, I know you make sense, but I am not going to agree with you until maybe we've got someone in the lodge other than Albo. Damien, talk some common sense to us. We can't have 4-year terms while this Labor government is in power, can we?
Will make some great points there, James, but I have to side with you there. I couldn't bear the thought of a 4-year term of a federal government of any particular stripe, to be honest. We have them up here in our state level politics, and it just seems like it takes forever to get back to the ballot box. And at a federal level, I think 3 years is quite long enough.
Amen. I'm with you on that. Will ignore everything you said, and we'll talk about it when there's a different Prime Minister. The Supreme Court of Western Australia has ruled a 62-year-old woman can have sperm removed from her deceased husband. Now, the couple tragically lost 2 children in accidents and were discussing having another via an overseas surrogate, but then the husband died suddenly before Christmas. Now, posthumous fertilisation is illegal in WA, so another court order would be required before the woman could use the sperm. But, Will, this raises a lot of ethical questions, doesn't it?
It does. In this instance, I'm okay with it because they could establish that the intent of the husband was to go ahead with it. But what I would say, it does indicate a worrying trend against protecting bodily autonomy in our court system. We've already seen over the COVID period that the courts didn't step in to protect bodily autonomy when coercive vaccine mandates were put in place. I can't believe that there are still jobs in this country where you need to have an experimental vaccine in your system to take that job. This is another example, albeit a limited one, where the court hasn't protected bodily autonomy. And I just wonder if the abortion debate was to rear its ugly head in Australia, whether the courts would stand up for the bodily autonomy of women in the way that perhaps they should. Just a thought.
All right, let me go to this story from Canberra. The Australian newspaper has revealed more than 10% of submissions to a Senate inquiry into legalising cannabis were likely written by people using AI. Now, I suppose on one level this is kind of encouraging. It means ChatGPT works even when you're stoned. But is it a problem, Damien, when people start using chatbots to generate submissions on important issues to the Senate?
I think it's a massive problem because, you know, you have these unfairly overblown, unrepresentative social media swarms that sort of pretend to be much bigger than they are. And with the power of AI, you can suddenly generate hundreds of submissions for any given cause and push an argument and pretend that there's massive support. So, look, yeah, I'm glad they work when you're otherwise a little bit inhibited, but it is a slippery slope.
Will, what Damien said is exactly what happened. I assume the Greens, well, I know the Greens called for lots of submissions. They said, let's flood this inquiry with submissions in support. And ChatGPT just makes it too easy, doesn't it? I mean, you take 30 seconds and it looks like you've spent hours on it.
Yeah, this is a blessing for the Greens. The ChatGPT will be writing the entire Greens policy platform before long. Damien is right in that I think it can create this volume of responses. But I think there's also an opportunity for good writers to be able to be more persuasive. You can see that ChatGPT does create some pretty mediocre, run-of-the-mill types of arguments in the way that it produces content. So I think that you'll get a lot of very average responses. But I think that also creates opportunities for people who are persuasive, who are strong with argumentation, to actually stand out from that dirge and make a case that is authentic.
All right, a lot of people are still on holidays, so let's talk about holidays, especially holidays for our premiers and our Prime Minister. Queensland Premier Stephen Miles is under fire for taking a Christmas holiday while the Gold Coast was being inundated by floods, which kind of reminds me of when Scott Morrison got in all sorts of trouble for being overseas while bushfires raged. Remember this?
They know that, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room. That's the brave people who do that are doing that job.
Well, Stephen Miles cut short his holiday to front a press conference with Gold Coast Mayor Tom Tate yesterday. Damien, is it just too dangerous for premiers and PMs to go away during Christmas these days?
Look, I think, being a North Queenslanders as we are, James, we probably would prefer to see less of politicians during natural disasters. But the standard has been set by the left and the Labor government in opposition, unfortunately. ScoMo's sort of stumbling answer to that question about holding a hose sadly has set the standard. And now, unfortunately, yes, politicians are judged by where they turn up and when. And especially during this most recent crisis in far north Queensland, Albo took several days before he landed up there. So Miles, as unfair as it is, and I think they're all entitled to holidays, has to now conform to that standard which his own side has set.
Pope Francis has used an end-of-year speech to talk about Nigerian Christians killed at Christmas. Have a listen and see if you can work out how these Christians died.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, purtroppo la celebrazione del Natale in Nigeria è stata segnata da gravi violenze nello stato di Plateau, con molte vittime. Prego per loro e le loro famiglie. Che Dio liberi la Nigeria da questi orrori.
Violence with many victims. OK, was there a fight over a car park? Did a Christmas party get out of hand? What the Pope meant to say was that 140 Nigerian Christians were murdered by Islamic jihadis. He might have added that, according to Nigerian human rights watchdog Intersociety, 52,000 Christians have been butchered or hacked to death for being Christians in Nigeria since 2009. So if people want to talk about a genocide, why do leaders seem so reluctant to call out Islamic extremists?
Cowardice, James. Cowardice. And it's cowardice in two forms. It's cowardice in response to the threat of physical harm. We saw tragically last year that Salman Rushdie finally met with that harm after spending his life, or the last 20 years of his life, under that threat. But it's also cowardice for being afraid to be called a racist. Now, we need to separate in Australia and abroad legitimate discussions about culture and religion with racism. It is not racist to call out many of the problems that surround the Islamic religion and Islamic culture. We need to be brave to have those open conversations. Unfortunately, too many people will say that you are a racist if you have that conversation. That's wrong, and leaders need to have more courage to stand up against that mentality.
Yeah, when even the Pope won't stand up for Christians, that's a problem. Let me finish with this and get a quick thought from both of you. The initial copyright on Disney's iconic Mickey Mouse has expired. The 1928 depiction of the character in Steamboat Willie has entered the public domain 95 years after it was released. So what do you reckon movie makers have done? They've rushed to the cinemas to release a Mickey Mouse horror movie. Have a look.
Where the hell did he go?
Damien, would you see a Mickey Mouse slasher movie, or do you think it looks a bit goofy?
Definitely looks goofy, as a lot of these sort of slasher horror movies do. But look, it's a credit to the marketing team at that movie studio that they knew the deadline was passing and they were able to get this movie out right on the day. So good on them.
Will, just a quick thought from you. Would you see that movie, or would you prefer Barbie?
I prefer neither. I'll be interested to see whether they have followed what South Park said is Disney's new strategy for casting, which is put a chick in it, make her lame, and make her gay. I'm not sure how that fits in with the slasher context, but we will see.
You know they'll find a way. Will Kingston, Damien Tomlinson, thanks so much for your time. Well, coming up in just a moment, the surge of anti-Semitism on university campuses across the world has claimed another scalp. I'll tell you why Harvard had no choice but to let its president go after her controversial remarks. Welcome back. Well, I'll admit Harvard University President Dr. Claudine Gay lasted longer than I expected. I thought that after saying student calls for the genocide of Jews might be okay, depending on the context, I thought she would have been forced to quit within the hour. But finally, it's caught up with her. 29 days after those remarks, and amid allegations she plagiarised the work of other researchers on several occasions, Dr. Gay has resigned. As one person I spoke to said, Harvard could either have someone who wouldn't call out anti-Semitism, or it could have a plagiariser, but it couldn't have both. Joining me now is the Australian's media writer, Sophie Ellsworth. Sophie, thanks for joining me. Let's just remind ourselves of what Dr. Claudine Gay said at that congressional hearing last month.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
Sophie, I'm shocked it's taken her so long to go after that, but really it's the plagiarism allegations that have been the final straw, hasn't it?
Well, James, great to be here. Yes, it's really a combination of both here. Really, those answers there were unbelievable. She should take up politics because that's pretty much what politicians master, not answering questions. And we saw that repeatedly there. People can see straight through that. But yes, there are, I was reading today, around 50 allegations of plagiarism. That is such a serious offence in her role as the president of Harvard. So she's gone. She had a tenure of just 6 months, the shortest ever at Harvard. And her career has taken a massive fall, and rightly so. But once you have plagiarism attached to your name, that's a very, very serious offence. And going through her work, I was looking at some of the pieces today. There were, side by side of where there were claims they were plagiarised from. You've got to credit that work where it's coming from. And it appears in many cases she was not doing that, James.
Sophie, you report on the media. I want to get your thoughts on how this CNN journalist reported on the plagiarism scandal. Have a listen to this.
These plagiarism allegations, where Claudine Gay has had to issue corrections, multiple corrections. Now, we should note that Claudine Gay has not been accused of stealing anyone's ideas in any of her writings. She's been accused of sort of more like copying other people's writings without attribution. So it's been more sloppy attribution than stealing anyone's ideas. But nonetheless, you put all of that together.
It wasn't stealing, it was just sloppy attribution, or as CNN would say, it was a mostly peaceful plagiarism.
Oh, please, that was absolutely atrocious. What's that journalist thinking? I mean, he's in the media. Plagiarism is a serious offence, and he should be calling it out, not sort of what appears to be excusing it, James. So I thought that was a shocking take, pretty embarrassing for that journalist.
Absolutely. Listen, the value of social media platform formerly known as Twitter, I'll always call it Twitter, but formerly known as Twitter, now X, the value has dropped 71% since it was bought by Elon Musk and renamed X. Twitter was valued at $44 billion in October 2022. It's now valued at $12 billion. This comes after a 15% drop in users, many of whom complained about hate speech, and companies pulling their ads after Musk was accused of anti-Semitism. Sophie, do you think X will be able to recover its value?
Well, James, there's not a lot of detail about why it has dropped its value so significantly. So I'll take this information with a big fat grain of salt. But yes, there are problems with X. There's no denying it. It's a pretty horrid platform. People get trolled on there. The verification's been upended. I mean, I'm getting some bizarre ads on my Twitter feed. I won't repeat here at night time of what's popping up in my feed. And I think it's got a lot of problems. And Elon Musk, I mean, James, he's so wealthy. He said to advertisers, big businesses the other day, if they don't like it, basically, a few coarse words he used and, tell your story walking. So it's got a long way to pick itself up, but it's a pretty grubby platform, like many social media platforms, if I'm honest.
Well, Elon Musk is worth over $250 billion, and he actually said he bought Twitter as a service to humanity. So maybe he doesn't care if the value drops. Sophie Ellsworth, appreciate your time tonight. Well, after the break, a warning for the US. It's set to face a reckoning in 2024. More after this. Well, the year ahead promises to be like no other, especially in the United States, where a number of dangerous ideas, events and forces are likely to catch up with the leader of the free world. Joining me to discuss is Victor Davis Hanson. He's a senior fellow at Hoover Institute at Stanford University, and he's also written and/or edited 26 books. Victor, thanks for joining me. You've called 2024 America's Year of Reckoning. Are things that dramatic in the United States?
Yeah, I think everybody's very worried. I mean, we've never had a president removed from a state ballot by someone who never charged him with the crime of insurrection, much less convicted him, but alleged that was a disqualifying. We have 8 million people that just crossed the border illegally and are residing here illegally, and everybody knows they broke the law. Everybody knows the law should be enforced, and apparently everybody thinks that's beyond our powers. We look at the world abroad after the Afghanistan debacle and the Chinese balloon, the Ukrainian invasion. I think there's a general perception that we can't protect our friends, much less deter our enemies. So, and then we have a $34 trillion debt. And I think everybody feels that we're at a tipping point. We either need a Reagan-esque or Lincoln-esque character or a rebooting of our culture or something to shake us out of it, or we're going to be into a late Roman-like decline.
You wrote an article over Christmas describing some of those challenges, one of which you've just mentioned, and that's America's failing deterrence abroad. What suggests America is no longer feared by its enemies, and what are the potential consequences, if that's true, over the next 12 months in particular?
Well, it's ironic because it's not a matter of wherewithal. We have 12 carrier groups. We've still got the greatest nuclear and conventional forces in the world, even with China's resurgence. But there's some kind of, on our left, which is in power now, there's a psychological impediment to the use of force, or at least the credible threat to use force. And all of our enemies, Iran or the Houthis or China or Russia, North Korea, they feel that we either can't or will not do anything. And when you have great power and you're afraid to exercise it, then you get a force multiplying effect of contempt by foolish, weaker powers that might try something stupid. And that stupid would be to attack us, because we do have the power to retaliate in a very formidable way, but they don't believe that anymore.
So if America is to correct that situation in terms of its international reputation, particularly that of its military, what would be required from the next administration?
Well, I think everybody understands that there's a reckoning coming, and we're going to have to go back to what made us powerful, and that was we were the one place in the world that had equality of opportunity, not of result, and we valued freedom and liberty over forced equality, and I think we have to get back to that. We've judged people on the content of their character and their merit, not the color of their skin, but we've been hijacked by a very small group of activists. And because of the COVID lockdown and the George Floyd riots and all of these turmoils, they seized power. And I think people realize that they were asleep at the wheel, and there's going to be a big correction, I hope, in 2024.
Are you talking particularly about the military and their recruitment, which is quite woke, isn't it, and really doesn't suit the dangerous times in which we live?
Yeah, we're short 50,000 soldiers. We had the chairman of the Joint Chief and the defense secretary claim that there was an epidemic of white privilege, white rage, and white supremacy. And now after a 2-year investigation, we just learned this month that that was completely fallacious. There was no evidence of that. And what we did was we went after the one demographic, white males from the lower middle classes, who have died at twice their numbers in the demographic in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were traditionally the people who volunteered for the worst of all combat. And so we also dismissed 8,400 people for failing to get the mandatory experimental mRNA vaccine when most of them had already had COVID and had immunity. Now we're begging them to come back. But I hope we can rectify this. But we have to have a radical change in the military leadership to go back to battlefield efficacy rather than just political correctness and wokeness.
So that's internationally. Domestically, America is also beset by problems, not least of which, I was going to say there's a problem at the southern border, but there doesn't seem to be a border anymore. The Biden administration is allowing, close to 250,000 illegal entrants a month. Why?
Yes.
And surely that can't continue in 2024, can it?
No, we had the problem solved finally at 2020 before Biden came in. There were almost zero illegal entries. But we don't know why it's going on, other than the obvious, that the left feels that its agenda does not have 51% support of the current constituencies. So they have a long-range plan of what they call demography is destiny, or the new Democratic majority, of bringing in voters who are poor, non-diverse, coming in legal, without skills, without education, without English, and therefore they will be quite dependent on an expanded welfare state, of which the left feels that they will be given credit for administering.
The reaction to the October 7 attacks, I want to talk to you about that, because that seems to have exposed a frightening amount of anti-Semitism and highlighted that a shockingly large number of young American people seem to have been radicalised not just to hate Israel, but to hate America. Is this just one of those things that will pass, or is this something that's going to come to a head?
Well, we've had fundamental changes in our major universities, especially our elite universities. Because they pay 110% of the cost, we've imported or allowed to come in hundreds of thousands of people from the Middle East on student visas and green cards. And then the DEI, so-called diversity, equity, inclusion constituencies, have merged with that, along with the elite left. And they feel that because they're self-declared victims under our cultural Marxist binary of oppressed, oppressors, victims, victimizers, that they can be free without any consequences, to be quite anti-Semitic, to the point where they've physically harassed Jewish students on our campuses. They've swarmed them. That's a toxic malady, though, that's shared, I think, in the former British the Commonwealth of Britain, your country, Europe. It's a Western disease.
On top of all of that, there's a presidential election next year that promises to be like none before it, with the Democrats using courts in a bid to prevent the frontrunner from even running. It sounds crazy to have to ask this, Victor, but can there be a peaceful election in the United States this year?
I think there can if the Supreme Court steps up and says the left is misusing an ancient statute about the old Confederacy, and people who are not elected cannot disqualify somebody for a crime that they have not even been charged with, much less convicted. Nobody's ever charged Donald Trump with insurrection. If we were to apply that standard, what we're going to have is a third worldism where every red conservative state would say to Joe Biden, you didn't enforce the oath of your office on the border, or your family's facing corruption, etc. Therefore, this Secretary of State in Nevada or this Secretary of State in Wyoming is going to take you off the ballot. You can see where that goes to. The biggest problem we're having, though, is not just the election, but we've lost all credibility. How can the Americans lecture anybody in the world about the value of a democracy and the integrity of consensual government when we don't adhere to it here at home? So I think everybody's upset. They're looking for the court to step in, and they're looking in 2024 for mass repudiation of this lawfare before it's too late. I think we're very close to, I don't want to say violence, but it's going to be a messy election, especially when the bi-coastal elite, where most of the globalized wealth is in the United States. The left has all the money now, and it's 3.5 times to 1. They outspent the conservative candidate in the last 2 elections. So it's going to be a very tough election.
Victor, some of the challenges we've talked about this evening, if they're not addressed in 2024, how long before America's decline is terminal, in your view?
Well, I look to certain things that are encouraging, and that is we still have the most powerful military. We still have the largest economy. We still have the freest society. We still have the most opportunity. We're the biggest oil producer, the biggest gas producer, even under Biden. We're the biggest food producer. We used to have the greatest universities. I think we still do in the sciences and math. But I guess the way to put it is that we're gliding or we're coasting on the fumes of better generations, and we haven't invested or contributed in my generation to that preeminence. And if we don't stop this, we're going to be in permanent decline. I think everybody's worried about it now. And the basics of society, whether it's homeless people or on the street, or excrement on the sidewalks, or breaking and entering your car in San Francisco, or not prosecuting mass looting, or open racial hostility, I think people realize that the fabric of society is starting to unwind and affect every one of us.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens in the United States in the year ahead. Victor Davis Hanson, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
After the break, the UK government is in crisis after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is caught lying over immigration numbers. More on that in just a moment. Well, the illegal immigration crisis in the UK is set to be a sticking point for Rishi Sunak's government, with an election expected this year. Joining me now from London is Star GB News host Patrick Christys. Patrick, Happy New Year for you, but not so much for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. It's only the 3rd day of the year and already he's engulfed in scandal. He posted this tweet boasting his government had cleared the backlog of asylum seeker claims, but figures actually show 100,000 migrants are still waiting for a decision. Cleared means zero, doesn't it? Not zero, give or take 100,000.
Yeah, well, it should. And also, I think it's quite a good example that our Prime Minister clearly thinks that we are all idiots. And what he's talking about is a legacy asylum seeker backlog. He's saying he's cleared it. Unfortunately for him, of that backlog, 17,000 people have just gone missing. Of the 25,000 people or so that they've rejected, it's not clear that any of them have been deported. And of the 63% that he has approved, well, what that really now means is that they all end up in social housing and on benefits, quite possibly for the rest of their lives, which does not save the taxpayer any money whatsoever, and that is clearly a massive problem here. They are saying that they've reduced the number of migrant hotels. We've had loads of people staying in hotels. Migrant hotels by 50. But again, the problem there is that if you take them out of hotels, you have to actually buy them new accommodation in the private sector, or you have to make the taxpayer pay for them in terms of social housing, etc. So it was an opportunity for the Prime Minister to try to say that he's achieved one of his big pledges. He's cleared that backlog, but really he's just rearranging the decking on the Titanic.
Patrick, you said that they've reduced the number of hotels housing illegal immigrants by 50, but there's still, as I understand it, 348 hotels across the UK being used for this purpose. It's incredible.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And some of those are luxury 4-star hotels. Some of those hotels are the only hotel in a rural community out there in the countryside. So all of a sudden, you wake up one day and there are 200 fighting-age young Afghan males who have just landed in your town. The town obviously will never be the same again as a result of that. People see massive cultural changes. And a big problem as well is the general level of deceit within government. And it was an exclusive that I managed to bring to our audience on GB News 9 to 11 p.m. UK time yesterday, which was that the advice from civil servants behind the scenes, the advice to government was to have an amnesty for illegal immigrants. So, you guys over there turned the boats back, did the job, solved the problem. Our big solution over here, let them all off and let them stay forever. It's not really a solution, is it?
It's not indeed. Listen, it's funny how woke both our countries are. Here in Australia for New Year's Eve, we had an Aboriginal band rapping about the stolen generation and being victims. They did that right before the 9 p.m. fireworks for kids. But in the UK, your fireworks are being slammed for being the wokest ever. Let's have a listen and then I want to get your comments.
It's 10 years since same-sex marriage was made legal in England and Wales.
London is a place for everyone, where you are free to be who you want to be and love who you want to love.
What? Why can't woke-tards just leave our traditions alone?
Look, honestly, 2024 was seconds old, and we had a game of woke bingo inflicted upon us here in this country. We had same-sex marriage, we had diversity, we had empire, we had the climate agenda. Look, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London there, arguably the best city in the world, flashed up right at the start of that, the mayor of London presents, like the kind of rampant narcissist he is. I tell you what he didn't present. He didn't present the fact that knife crime is going through the roof, that rapes are going through the roof, that burglaries and thefts and robberies are going through the roof, and that climate emissions, okay, from that single firework display, despite him taxing ordinary working Brits to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds for the green agenda, climate emissions of that were the equivalent of cars driving thousands of miles. It's an absolute shocker.
All right, now I want to end the show on a sport that I don't know much about, I've got to admit, but I understand in the UK darts is huge, and you've got a 16-year-old kid who's made the World Championship. I want you to tell me about him in a moment, but first let's have a look at the moment that he threw the dart that got him into the World Championship final.
Treble 20 here will leave a fitting finish on double 10, and he finishes it on double 10. Luke Littler by name, but right now arguably the biggest name in world darts. Littler takes the giant step into the World Championship final, 19 days shy of his 17th birthday.
All right, for a non-darts person, explain to me why this is such a big deal.
Right, this guy's 16 years old. He looks about 35. He's got a 21-year-old girlfriend. He's got the chance to win £200,000 tomorrow. This guy's living the flipping dream, okay? Luke the Nuke has come out of absolutely nowhere. And if he wins the World Darts Championship tomorrow, he'll be the youngest person ever to do it. Look, not all heroes wear capes. Some of them eat kebabs and smoke vapes. And that is 16-year-old Luke Littler, a true British sporting legend.
Well, honestly, for the first time in my life, tomorrow morning Australian time, I'll be checking the darts results. First time that's ever happened, probably the last as well, Patrick. Thanks so much for your time. Well, that's it from me. I'll be back tomorrow night. Up next is an encore of part one of Piers Morgan's award-winning interview with star footballer Cristiano Ronaldo. You don't want to miss that. It's coming up.